Kiana Davis, a hardworking nurse from a small southern town, unexpectedly inherits a vast fortune and estate from a great-grandfather she never knew. As she steps into a world of power and influence, Kiana faces racial prejudice, jealousy, and the ghosts of her family's dark past. With enemies around every corner and the weight of the town's judgment upon her, Kiana must decide whether to protect her inheritance or use it to uplift the very people who once looked down on her. But will uncovering the town's darkest secrets come at a price she's not prepared to pay? Before we get started, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe for more exciting content, and let us know where you're watching from in the comments. Now, let's dive in. Kiana Davis was used to life's hard edges. As the sun broke the horizon each morning, she was already up, her feet hitting the cold floor of the small house she shared with her ailing grandmother, Miss Ora, and her teenage brother, Marcus. There was no time to rest. Between her grueling 12-hour shifts at the local clinic and managing the needs of her family, Kiana had little left for herself. The weight of responsibility sat heavy on her shoulders, but she bore it with quiet strength. It had been that way for as long as she could remember. Kiana was always the one who had to keep everything together. In the small southern town where she lived, respect was hard-earned, especially for a black woman like her. She had fought tooth and nail for everything: her nursing degree, her modest home, and the fragile stability she had built for her family. But no matter how hard she worked, the world often seemed determined to remind her of her place. The town was old, steeped in traditions that clung to the past. It had an unspoken hierarchy, and Kiana was always made to feel like she was at the bottom. Her life was a balancing act, caring for her patients with kindness, making sure Marcus stayed out of trouble, and attending to Miss Ora, whose health was steadily declining. Despite the challenges, Kiana remained hopeful. She dreamed of a better future for Marcus, of a life where he could escape the confines of the town's narrow-mindedness. For herself, she wasn't sure what she wanted. Maybe just a moment to breathe, to feel like she had a future that was hers. That evening, as she stood at the stove stirring a pot of rice, her phone buzzed on the counter. She wiped her hands on a towel and glanced at the screen. It was an unfamiliar number. She almost didn't answer. Telemarketers had become a nuisance lately, but something made her pick it up. "Miss Davis?" The voice on the other end was formal, crisp. "This is Henry Mason, an attorney with the law firm of Brooks & Mason in New York." Kiana frowned. New York? She had no business with anyone up there. "Yes, this is Kiana Davis," she replied cautiously, her guard immediately up. "I'm calling regarding the estate of your great-grandfather, Henry Davis." Her great-grandfather? The name struck a chord, but it felt distant, almost like a ghost from a forgotten time. Miss Ora had rarely spoken of Henry Davis, her father, and Kiana had never known much about him. From the little she had heard, he had left the South a long time ago, heading north in pursuit of something more, something better. The family didn't talk about him, and over the years Kiana had stopped asking. "I'm sorry, I'm not sure I understand," Kiana said, gripping the phone tighter. "What does this have to do with me?" "Your great-grandfather passed away recently," Mr. Mason continued, his voice steady, "and as his last surviving heir, you have inherited his entire estate." Kiana's breath caught in her throat. Inherited? Her? The very idea seemed absurd. She didn't even know the man, much less anything about his estate. Her mind raced trying to catch up with the lawyer's words. What did that even mean? What kind of estate? I think there must be a mistake," Kiana stammered, shaking her head as if the lawyer could see her disbelief. "There's no mistake, Miss Davis. Henry Davis left behind substantial assets, multiple businesses, real estate, investments, and you are the sole beneficiary. I'd like to schedule a meeting to discuss the details and begin the transfer of the estate." The kitchen around Kiana seemed to fade as the weight of what he was saying settled on her. She had inherited a fortune? It was too much to process. Her whole life, she had fought for scraps, for respect, for survival. And now, this? It felt unreal, like a dream she wasn't sure she wanted to believe in. When can we meet?" she finally managed to ask, her voice barely steady. "We can arrange a meeting at your earliest convenience. I'll need you to come to New York to sign the necessary documents. I'll send over the details of the estate beforehand so you have a full understanding of what you're inheriting." After a few more exchanges, Kiana hung up the phone, her hands shaking slightly. She stood in the middle of her small kitchen, the smell of the rice cooking on the stove filling the air, but she felt miles away. In that moment, everything she thought she knew about her life, about her family, seemed to shift. She had always been taught to believe that wealth was something other people had, people who didn't look like her, people who didn't live like her. And yet here she was, about to inherit something she couldn't even begin to comprehend. She sat down at the kitchen table, her mind swirling with questions. Why had her great-grandfather left the South? Why had no one in the family spoken about him? And most importantly, what was she supposed to do with all this? The money, the businesses. It was more than just a financial windfall. It was a responsibility, a legacy. Later that evening, as she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, Kiana couldn't sleep. The town she lived in barely acknowledged her existence, and now she was about to become one of the wealthiest people in it. She knew that kind of change wouldn't go unnoticed. People would talk, people would judge, and Kiana, who had spent her whole life fighting to prove her worth, would have to navigate a whole new set of challenges. But one thing was clear. This inheritance, this unexpected windfall, was about to change everything. Kiana had always been a woman of practicality, grounded by the realities of her life. There was no time for daydreams, no space in her world for indulgences. Yet, as the days passed after that fateful phone call, she found herself engulfed in a new reality she could barely recognize. The first time she stepped foot onto the grounds of her great-grandfather's estate, it felt like entering another world. The mansion, perched on a hill just outside of town, was nothing short of imposing. It loomed with its grand columns, wide terraces, and sprawling lawns that seemed to stretch endlessly. Kiana had only ever seen such places in movies, places where the rich and powerful lived. The thought that it now belonged to her seemed too surreal to process. When the lawyer, Mr. Mason, guided her up the stone steps and into the vast entryway of the mansion, her breath caught. The house was enormous, easily 5 times the size of the house she'd grown up in with Miss Ora and Marcus. The floors were a rich dark wood, polished to a mirror-like shine. Chandeliers hung from high ceilings, casting soft light across the antique furniture that filled every room. Each piece seemed to tell its own story. Ornate chairs, intricate tapestries, and large oil paintings of people she did not know, but could only assume were ancestors long gone. "This was your great-grandfather's home for the last decade of his life," Mr. Mason explained, as they walked through the halls. He had it restored after moving back from New York. Kiana had heard very little about Henry Davis throughout her life. Miss Ora, her grandmother, had always been vague when it came to discussing him. All Kiana knew was that he had left the South long ago, and for reasons no one ever fully explained, he had cut off contact with most of the family. Now, standing in the middle of the life he had built, she felt the weight of a man she had never known pressing in on her. Mr. Mason continued to explain the details of her inheritance. Multiple businesses, substantial investments, and shares in companies she had never even heard of. The numbers were overwhelming. Her life, up until now, had been about carefully balancing budgets, scraping by on her nurse's salary to support Marcus and care for Miss Ora. Suddenly, she was being handed wealth beyond anything she could have imagined. As the reality of her new situation sank in, so too did the inevitable reactions of the town. Whispers began almost immediately after news of her inheritance spread. In a place as small as hers, word traveled fast. People who had once passed her by with barely a glance now stared as she walked by. The stares weren't admiring. They were filled with suspicion, curiosity, and, in some cases, resentment. Kiana could feel it in every interaction. The very same people who had ignored her now seemed to be studying her, trying to understand how someone like her, a black woman from a modest background, had suddenly come into such wealth and power. At the grocery store, the cashier, who had always been polite but distant, was suddenly overly friendly, asking questions that veiled her curiosity. "Must be nice living in that big house," she said with a forced smile. Kiana merely nodded, avoiding the conversation. She could feel the shift in the air around her. Then there were the not-so-subtle comments overheard in passing as she walked through town. "She doesn't deserve it," some muttered, their voices just loud enough to reach her ears. What did she ever do to earn that kind of money? She knew what they really meant. It wasn't just that she had come into wealth so unexpectedly. It was that she was a black woman, someone they had never seen as part of their world, now owning a mansion and businesses that gave her power in a town that had always treated her as an outsider. It was as if her sudden rise to wealth threatened their sense of order, their deeply ingrained beliefs about who should and shouldn't have power. The town had its unspoken hierarchy, one based not just on money, but on lineage and race. The wealthiest families had been around for generations, and while they didn't flaunt their prejudices openly, they held on to them tightly. Kiana's newfound wealth had upended the balance, and people were not shy about showing their discomfort. The pressure mounted as Kiana tried to settle into her new life. The mansion, though beautiful, felt cold and unfamiliar. It wasn't a home. Not yet. She found herself wandering its halls at night, overwhelmed by the vastness of it all, the echoes of footsteps in empty rooms reminding her of how alone she felt. The house, with all its grandeur, felt like a cage. But there was something more than just the whispers and the isolation. As Kiana dug deeper into the businesses she had inherited, she began to uncover things that made her uneasy. Henry Davis had been a shrewd businessman, and while his wealth was vast, not all of it seemed to have come from honest dealings. The more she learned, the more questions she had. Some of the companies Henry had owned were still active in the town. Businesses that employed people, Kiana knew, people who had once been her neighbors. But there were rumors, old stories whispered among those who had worked for him years ago. Stories about deals made behind closed doors, about how Henry had built his empire on the backs of the poor and marginalized. The businesses he had left her were profitable, but their pasts were murky, tainted by exploitation and corruption. Kiana felt a knot forming in her stomach. How could she accept this wealth, knowing what it was built on? The inheritance that was supposed to be a blessing now felt like a burden, weighed down by the sins of the past. She had worked her whole life to live with integrity, to provide for her family through honest means. Now it seemed she had been handed a legacy that was anything but clean. As if the internal conflict wasn't enough, the hostility from the town grew. Small things at first, cold stares, whispers in the grocery store, but soon it escalated. One morning, as Kiana pulled into the clinic parking lot where she still worked as a nurse, she noticed a crowd of people gathered outside. At first, she thought it was just a protest, something about local healthcare funding perhaps. But when she got closer, she realized they weren't there for the clinic. A hand-painted sign caught her eye. "We don't want her kind here." The words hit her like a punch to the gut. Her kind. It was a phrase loaded with all the ugliness of the town's unspoken racism, the bitterness of people who couldn't stand the thought of someone like her having what they believed didn't belong to her. She stood frozen for a moment, the noise of the crowd buzzing in her ears. The stares were hateful, the signs crude. It wasn't just about her inheritance, it was about who she was, what she represented. A black woman with power and influence in a town that had always tried to keep people like her down. Kiana knew that things were only going to get harder from here. The more she tried to embrace her new life, the more resistance she faced. But deep down, she also knew that walking away wasn't an option. She had been given this opportunity for a reason, and no matter how much the town wanted to push her out, she wasn't going to let them. She had survived too much to be beaten down by whispers and signs. As the crowd shouted and the tension around her thickened, Kiana stood tall. This fight was just beginning. The mansion's grandeur began to wear thin for Kiana. As the days passed, she found herself more unsettled by the history of the place than its elegance. At first, she had been overwhelmed by the sheer size of her inheritance, the sprawling estate, the businesses, the financial security. But as she delved deeper into the legacy left to her, the excitement faded, replaced by an uncomfortable feeling in the pit of her stomach. The estate's paperwork was a mountain she barely knew how to climb. Legal documents, contracts, and ledgers filled the study, all detailing the operations of the businesses her great-grandfather had controlled. One evening, Kiana sat down to go through them, determined to understand what she had truly inherited. She wanted to believe this was a gift, a blessing. But the more she read, the more she realized there was a darker side to Henry Davis's success. The businesses were still profitable, but as Kiana combed through old records, she noticed irregularities. There were gaps in the financial history, payments made to individuals she couldn't identify, deals that didn't quite add up. The more she read, the more suspicious she became. The prosperity her great-grandfather had built seemed to have come at the expense of others. There were whispered stories about how he had driven local competitors out of business, taken advantage of poor workers, and manipulated the system to ensure he stayed on top. Kiana's stomach churned. This wasn't the legacy she had imagined. She had always believed in hard work, in earning her way, but now she was faced with the reality that her great-grandfather's wealth had been built on exploitation and unethical practices. How could she reconcile this with her values? How could she continue to benefit from something so tainted? She pushed the papers aside, leaning back in the leather chair in the study, staring at the ceiling. The room, with its dark wood paneling and old-world charm, felt oppressive now. The mansion wasn't just a symbol of wealth. It was a reminder of the power dynamics that had shaped the town, the kind of power that had kept people like her family down for generations. It wasn't just about her great-grandfather either. As she dug deeper into the records, she began to see names she recognized, local families who had been involved in Henry Davis's dealings. Some of these families still held sway in the town, their power passed down through generations just like the Davis fortune. Kiana couldn't shake the feeling that there were people in the town who didn't want her to uncover these truths. They had benefited from Henry's actions, and now, with her at the helm of his empire, they were threatened. The first indication that her suspicions were correct came in the form of an anonymous letter. It arrived one morning, slipped under the front door of the mansion. The envelope was plain, the paper inside creased and worn, as if it had been handled many times before reaching her. "You don't know what you're dealing with. Stop digging into the past, or you'll regret it." The message was short, but its meaning was clear. Someone knew she was looking into Henry's history, and they didn't like it. Kiana's first instinct was fear, a cold, creeping fear that settled deep in her bones. But that fear quickly morphed into anger. She had faced too much in her life to be scared off by threats, especially not now. Determined to find out who had sent the letter, Kiana went to the only person she knew who could help, James, an old friend of her grandmother's who had lived in the town for as long as anyone could remember. James had always been a source of wisdom, someone Miss Aura had trusted, and Kiana figured if anyone knew the town's secrets, it would be him. She drove to his small house on the edge of town, the car kicking up dust on the unpaved road. James greeted her at the door with a warm smile, but his eyes held a knowing look, as if he had been expecting her. "Come on in, child," he said, stepping aside to let her into the modest living room. "I've been wondering when you'd show up." Kiana sat down on the worn couch, her nerves prickling. "I need to ask you about my great-grandfather, about what really went on with him." James sighed deeply, settling into an armchair across from her. His face was lined with age, but his eyes were sharp. "I figured it wouldn't take long for you to start asking questions." Kiana handed him the anonymous letter. He glanced at it, then set it down on the table between them. "They're trying to scare you," he said, his voice steady. "There's a lot of people in this town who don't want you digging too deep into your family's past." "What did he do?" Kiana asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "What did Henry Davis do to make people so angry, even after all these years?" James leaned back in his chair, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. "Your great-grandfather was a complicated man. He wasn't a villain, but he wasn't a saint either. He built his empire by being ruthless, by cutting deals that benefited him and hurt a lot of other folks. Some of those deals put local people out of business, others took advantage of workers who didn't have any other options. He didn't break the law, but he walked the line so close that it's hard to say he was ever truly fair." Kiana felt a wave of disappointment wash over her. She had hoped for something redeeming, some explanation that would make it easier to accept the wealth she had inherited. But there was no escaping the truth. Henry had been willing to do whatever it took to succeed, even if it meant stepping on others. James continued. There's more to it, though. Henry made enemies, powerful ones. Some of those enemies never forgave him for leaving town, for taking his wealth and heading north. And now that you've inherited everything, you're stirring up old resentments. Kiana felt a chill run down her spine. She had inherited not just the wealth, but the enemies that came with it. And it seemed they were willing to do whatever it took to keep her from uncovering the full story. "Do you know who sent this letter?" she asked, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her. James shook his head. "Could be a number of people. There's plenty of folks who have a stake in keeping the past buried. But if I were you, I'd watch your back." Kiana nodded, her resolve hardening. She wasn't going to let fear stop her. If anything, the letter had only fueled her determination. She needed to know the full truth, no matter how painful or dangerous it might be. She had come too far to back down now. As she left James's house, her mind was racing. The town's elite had kept their hands clean for years, hiding behind their polished facades while benefiting from the same system that had oppressed people like her family. But now that Kiana had control of her great-grandfather's fortune, she had the power to expose the truth, to bring justice where it had long been denied. That night, as she sat in the mansion's study once again, Kiana knew she had a choice to make. She could quietly accept the wealth, live a comfortable life, and ignore the skeletons in her family's closet. Or she could use her position to dig deeper, to uncover the secrets that had been hidden for so long, and to make things right. The weight of her great-grandfather's legacy pressed down on her, but this time she didn't feel overwhelmed by it. Instead, she felt a sense of purpose. She wasn't just going to inherit the Davis fortune, she was going to rewrite its story. As the moonlight filtered through the tall windows of the mansion, Kiana made her decision. She would continue to dig. No matter the threats, no matter the danger, the past would not stay buried for long. The tension that had been simmering since Kiana's inheritance now seemed ready to boil over. The town, once content to keep its disdain toward her whispered in private, was becoming more overt in its hostility. Her mere presence in the mansion seemed to challenge the town's long-established hierarchy, and her determination to uncover the truth about her great-grandfather's business dealings had only intensified the resentment. It started with small acts of aggression. Sideways glances, snide comments thrown her way when she visited the local shops, and then more personal attacks. Someone vandalized her car, keying slurs into the paint. The health clinic she had funded in the poorer part of town was repeatedly targeted, its windows smashed, and hateful messages spray-painted on the walls. The message was clear. She wasn't welcome here, and they wanted her to know it. Kiana tried to brush it off at first, telling herself that this was just the town pushing back against change. She'd seen it before, growing up here. Progress, especially when it came to race and power, was always met with resistance. But these acts felt more personal, more vicious than anything she had experienced before. They weren't just attacking her as an individual. They were attacking what she represented. A black woman with wealth, influence, and a voice. The local police didn't seem particularly interested in helping her either. When she reported the vandalism at the clinic, the officer on duty gave her a thin-lipped smile, his eyes barely meeting hers as he took down the details in a half-hearted manner. "Probably just some kids messing around," he said with a shrug. "Nothing to worry about." Kiana clenched her jaw but said nothing. She knew what this was. They weren't going to help her. The same people who were supposed to protect and serve had their own prejudices, their own allegiances to the town's old guard. She was on her own, and the realization of that stung. The harassment continued, growing bolder with each passing day. Anonymous letters showed up at the mansion, the messages inside growing more threatening. "Get out while you still can," one letter read, the words crudely scrawled in red ink. Another warned, "This town doesn't belong to you." Kiana's hands trembled as she read them, but she refused to let fear take control. She had come too far, fought too hard to let these cowards scare her away. Still, the weight of the threats began to wear on her. Every time she left the mansion, she felt eyes on her, watching her every move. At night, she would lie in bed, staring at the darkened ceiling, her mind racing with thoughts of what might happen next. The mansion, with all its size and grandeur, no longer felt like a place of refuge. Instead, it felt like a fortress under siege. It was during one of those sleepless nights that Kiana made a decision. She couldn't sit back and wait for something to happen. If the town was going to come after her, she had to fight back, not with fear or intimidation, but by taking action. She decided to use her great-grandfather's wealth to its full potential. She would expand the community health clinic despite the attacks, and double down on her initiative to support young black entrepreneurs in the town. She wasn't just going to survive in this town, she was going to thrive, and she was going to help others do the same. The following morning, Kiana set to work. She met with the team managing her businesses, laying out her plans to reinvest in the community. Her great-grandfather's wealth had been used to build his empire, but now she intended to use it to lift others up. She funded scholarships for black students, provided seed money for small business owners, and started a legal aid program to help those in the town who had been systematically oppressed. But with each step forward, the resistance grew stronger. Joseph Reed, the town's powerful mayor, made it his personal mission to block her efforts. Reed, who came from one of the town's oldest and wealthiest families, had always been a subtle force behind the scenes, pulling the strings to maintain the status quo. He had benefited from the same system that had once been intertwined with her great-grandfather's business practices, and he saw Kiana's efforts as a direct threat to his influence. Reed began to obstruct her projects at every turn. Zoning laws were suddenly enforced to block the expansion of the clinic. Permits for her community initiatives were mysteriously delayed or denied. Every time she tried to make progress, Reed was there, using the full weight of his office to stymie her. One evening, after a particularly frustrating meeting with the town council, where her proposal to expand the clinic was rejected yet again, Kiana felt the familiar sting of helplessness creeping in. As she drove home, the sky heavy with the threat of rain, she wondered if she had underestimated the depth of the town's hostility. Was she truly making a difference, or was she simply running up against a wall that could never be knocked down? She pulled into the driveway of the mansion, her headlights cutting through the darkness. As she stepped out of the car, the air felt unusually still, the kind of stillness that made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. She took a deep breath and walked toward the front door. That's when she saw it. Spray painted across the front of the mansion's pristine white facade in large, angry red letters were the words, "Leave or you'll be sorry." Kiana froze, her heart pounding in her chest. For a moment, all she could do was stare at the message, her mind struggling to process the threat. They had come to her home. They had defiled the place that was supposed to be hers, the symbol of her great-grandfather's legacy, and by extension, her own. The fear that she had been pushing down for weeks now surged to the surface, but along with it came something else. Anger. Hot, blistering anger that burned away the fear, leaving only determination in its place. She wasn't going to be scared off. She wasn't going to let them win. She quickly called the police, though she knew they would likely be of little help. The officer who arrived was the same one who had dismissed her previous complaints. He took one look at the vandalism, made a few notes, and offered the same nonchalant response. "Probably just kids," he muttered, avoiding eye contact. Kiana clenched her fists. She was done with being dismissed, with being told that her concerns didn't matter. This was more than just a personal attack. It was an attack on everything she had worked for, everything she wanted to build. The next morning, Kiana called a press conference. If the town wanted to silence her, they would have to do it in the public eye. She stood on the steps of the mansion. Reporters gathered in front of her and spoke directly to the people who had been watching her from the shadows. "I didn't come here to fight," she began, her voice strong and steady. "I came here to build, to use the wealth that was passed down to me to help this community, to lift up those who have been held down for too long. But I see now that there are people who are afraid of change, afraid of what it means to see someone like me, a black woman, succeed in a town that has never welcomed people like me with open arms." She paused, letting her words sink in. The crowd was silent, hanging on her every word. "I will not be intimidated. I will not be pushed out. This mansion, this town, this future, it belongs to all of us, and I will fight for it." Her words rippled through the town, reaching the people who needed to hear them most. The marginalized, the ignored, the overlooked. Kiana wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for everyone who had been told they didn't belong, for everyone who had been kept down by a system that refused to change. But she also knew that her fight wasn't over. Joseph Reed wasn't done with her, and neither were the forces working to keep the town frozen in its past. Kiana had declared her intention to stay, but the battle that lay ahead would test her resolve in ways she couldn't yet imagine. As she turned to walk back into the mansion after the press conference, the wind picked up, carrying with it the faint scent of rain. A storm was coming, and Kiana Davis was ready for it. The morning air was thick with anticipation as Kiana stood before the charred remains of the community health clinic. The fire had ravaged the building overnight, leaving nothing but ashes and the skeletal frames of what once was a beacon of hope. The scent of smoke lingered, a haunting reminder of the lengths to which her adversaries would go. Marcus approached her quietly, his footsteps crunching on the debris-strewn ground. "They think this will stop you," he said, anger simmering in his eyes. "That you'll pack up and leave." Kiana turned to face her brother, her expression resolute. "They're wrong. This isn't just about me anymore. It's about everyone they've tried to silence." Word of the arson spread quickly, igniting outrage among the townspeople who had benefited from the clinic. A crowd began to gather. Patients, staff, volunteers, and supporters from all walks of life. Faces reflected a mix of sorrow and determination. An elderly woman stepped forward, her cane tapping lightly against the pavement. "Miss Davis," she called out, her voice wavering yet firm, "we won't let them do this. We're with you." Kiana felt a surge of gratitude. "Thank you," she replied, her voice carrying over the murmurs of the crowd. "This clinic was built for all of us, and together we'll rebuild it." The attack galvanized the community, sparking a unity that transcended long-standing divisions. Volunteers offered their skills and resources to begin reconstruction. Donations poured in, not just from the town, but from neighboring cities and supporters who had heard her story. Determined to confront the corruption head-on, Kiana delved deeper into her great-grandfather's archives, convinced that the key to dismantling the town's power structure lay hidden within. Late into the night, she and Marcus sifted through dusty ledgers, faded photographs, and brittle letters in the mansion's attic. "Look at this," Marcus said, pulling out a ledger marked with the initials HD. Inside were records of transactions, dates, and names. Prominent figures in the town, including Joseph Reed's ancestors. Kiana's eyes scanned the pages. These are payments made to suppress property sales to black families, funds allocated to manipulate elections, bribes to law enforcement. She shook her head in disbelief. It's a web of systemic oppression, all meticulously documented. Among the documents, they discovered letters between Henry Davis and a man named Thomas Whitaker, a journalist who had mysteriously disappeared decades ago. The letters revealed that Henry had been compiling evidence to expose the corruption but vanished before he could act. "It seems great-grandfather had a change of heart," Kiana mused. "Perhaps he intended to make things right." Marcus nodded. "Maybe that's why he left everything to you, so you could finish what he started." Armed with undeniable proof, Kiana knew it was time to act. She contacted an investigative journalist from a major newspaper, someone known for exposing political scandals. Together, they prepared a comprehensive exposé detailing the town's deep-rooted corruption, complete with copies of the incriminating documents. When the story broke, it sent shockwaves through the community and beyond. Headlines blared, "Legacy of corruption unveiled in small-town scandal. Mayor Joseph Reed implicated in decades-long oppression scheme." News vans lined the streets, and reporters clamored for statements from town officials. Joseph Reed attempted damage control, holding a press conference on the steps of the town hall. Dressed in a crisp suit, he faced the cameras with feigned confidence. "These allegations are nothing more than a smear campaign orchestrated by an outsider intent on destroying our community," he declared. "I assure you, we will fight this defamation with every legal avenue available." But the evidence was irrefutable. Under pressure from state authorities, an official investigation was launched. Whistleblowers came forward, emboldened by Kiana's courage. Former employees, suppressed business owners, and even members of Reed's own staff testified to the systemic corruption. One afternoon, as Kiana reviewed plans for the clinic's reconstruction, she received a call from an unknown number. She hesitated before answering. "Miss Davis," the voice on the other end drawled, a voice she recognized as Joseph Reed's. "I underestimated you." "Mr. Reed," she replied coolly, "to what do I owe this call?" "You've made your point," he said, a hint of menace underlying his words. "But consider the consequences of your actions, for yourself and for those you care about." Kiana's grip tightened on the phone. "Is that a threat?" "Just a friendly piece of advice," he said before the line went dead. Undeterred, Kiana reported the call to the authorities. The incident added fuel to the fire, further incriminating Reed. Within days, he was arrested on charges of corruption, intimidation, and conspiracy. As he was led away in handcuffs, a crowd gathered, some jeering, others silent. The fall of Joseph Reed marked a turning point. Barriers that had long hindered progress began to crumble. The town council, now under scrutiny, approved the permits for Kiana's initiatives without opposition. The police department faced a thorough overhaul, with several officers dismissed and policies reformed. Kiana's community projects flourished. The health clinic was rebuilt, expanding its services to include educational programs and a food pantry. The initiative for young Black entrepreneurs blossomed, resulting in new businesses that revitalized the local economy. Amid these developments, Kiana took steps to address her great-grandfather's complex legacy. She established the Henry Davis Foundation, dedicated to promoting social justice, transparency, and reconciliation. The foundation funded scholarships, supported investigative journalism, and created platforms for marginalized voices. At the mansion, no longer a symbol of isolation but a hub of community activity, Kiana hosted open forums, art exhibitions, and cultural events. The once intimidating gates stood open, inviting all who wished to partake in building a better future. One evening, Kiana stood on the mansion's grand porch, watching as families strolled along the street, children laughed in the nearby park, and the warm glow of streetlights bathed the town in a hopeful light. Marcus joined her, offering a cup of tea. "It's remarkable, isn't it?" he said softly. "How much has changed?" She smiled, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "It is, but there's still work to be done." He nodded. "True, but you've shown everyone that change is possible." Miss Ora shuffled out to join them, her eyes reflecting the twinkle of the stars overhead. "Your parents would be so proud," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "You took a burden and turned it into a blessing for all of us." Kiana reached out to embrace her grandmother. "I couldn't have done it without you both," she replied. "Family is what gave me strength." As they stood together, a sense of peace enveloped them. The trials they had faced were immense, but the triumphs were even greater. The town had begun to heal, old wounds acknowledged, and new paths forged. In the months that followed, Kiana continued her efforts, always mindful of the balance between honoring the past and shaping the future. She collaborated with local schools to integrate programs on history and social justice, ensuring that the next generation would learn from the mistakes of those before them. The mansion's attic, once a repository of secrets, was transformed into a public archive. Scholars, students, and citizens could now access historical documents, fostering transparency and understanding. One day, while sorting through the last of the attic's boxes, Kiana discovered a photograph tucked between the pages of a book. It was a picture of her great-grandfather Henry and Eleanor Thompson, the activist from the letters, standing side by side, their expressions resolute. On the back, a handwritten note read, "For the future we dared to dream. May those who come after us make it a reality." Kiana felt a lump in her throat. Holding the photograph, she whispered, "We're getting there." The journey had been arduous, filled with obstacles she could never have anticipated. But through resilience, solidarity, and an unwavering commitment to justice, she had helped steer the town toward a brighter horizon. As the sun set on another day, casting hues of gold and crimson across the sky, Kiana stepped outside. The weight of her inheritance no longer felt like a burden, but a gift, an opportunity to effect meaningful change. She took a deep breath, the cool air filling her lungs. There was still much to do, but she was no longer alone. The community stood with her, ready to continue the work they had begun together. "The weight of gold," she murmured, recalling the journey that had brought her here. "It's not about what we have, but what we do with it." With renewed determination, Kiana walked toward the future she had helped build. A future where everyone had a place, where voices were heard, and where the legacy she left behind would be one of hope, unity, and enduring change. Thanks for joining us. If you enjoyed this story, don't miss the next one. Click on the video now to watch. We appreciate your support, and we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments.